Hello, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me well? Yes, good. My name is Magali Delmas. I'm a professor at UCLA at the Institute of the Environment and the Anderson School of Management, and I'm very pleased today to be moderating this panel on renewable and sustainable energy, overcoming policy, economic, and business barriers. It's a kind of a long title and a big program, I think. We have a lot to say. We have great speakers. You don't see them yet. They're going to be sitting in a minute. We thought it would be good for them to actually be, kind of able to see the presentations from the other panelists. We have Mary Leslie, who is the president of the Los Angeles Business Council, and who's going to talk to us about the feed-in tariff program, and I think a great success story with the feed-in tariff. Is them? Excellent. We'll have a business perspective on what are the barriers to adopt renewable energy. Marvin Moon, who is the director of Power System Engineering Division at the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, is going to also address, I hope, some of these issues of feed-in tariff and other policies. This is, I think we have a great representation here from business, utilities, and the business community on what needs to be done to achieve more renewables. And then we'll have also perspective from two professors, Deepak Rajagopal, who is an assistant professor at the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. Professor Rajagopal is a specialist of biofuel and is going to, as an environmental economist, is going to provide us with the perspective of what happened with biofuel and try to translate that to other renewable technologies. Professor Ramteen Sioshansi, sorry if I don't pronounce it well, is also a professor of integrated system engineering at Ohio State University, and he's going to provide us with his perspective from about renewable energies from the storage perspective. So he's going to talk about storage. So I think we have a great panel, very different perspectives. And so I just wanted to say a few words of what I think this is important, what the panelists are going to talk about, and what this is a very important subject. I'm just going to give you this map. I wrote a paper a few years ago on what drives states to adopt renewable portfolio standards and increase their renewable capacity. And what I found interesting is that there's not a 100% match between the renewable resources and the policies that are put into place or the capacity that is installed. If you look at this one, and if you can do that for a solar, if you look at the map of the world and you see all these solar systems installed in Germany, it doesn't make sense, right? Normally you would see them, you should see them here, or more in Texas or in other places. Here, if you look at the wind power, the wind blows in the Midwest, as we know, and it's clear. I mean, on this map, if you look at the colors, you have the red, the pink, but this is not really where you have the wind installations, the wind farms, and you see some kind of disconnect here from where the resource exists and where the capacity is installed. So what's going on? Why do you see this disconnect? Why don't we have more solar in California? What's happening? So we did some, and that's very, just to talk a little bit about what we did. We did some regression in the last, that was from 1997 to 2006. What explained the adoption of renewable portfolio standards? Is it the resource? And you look at here, like we did that by state. So it's a state, each unit is one state per year. You see that wind resources are important. Like if you look at this, when you have stars, that means it's a significant factor and positive. Okay, so that's a coefficient for a regression. You can see wind is important. Solar resources are important. Biomass is not. But then you see, for example, having a democratic representative is also important. Having renewable association in that state, active association, is actually probably as important as the resource. I mean, it's correlated, but you could see, and that's kind of I'm talking also for the business panelist here, for the Los Angeles Business Council, this is a big driver. And we see that, and I think we'll get more in-depth knowledge about why what they do is important. We see also that these are states that have higher income, lower employment, and so these economic factors are really important. So when you look at a regression like this, you say, just the resource is important, but the economic factor, political factors are very important. So then we have the list of what are the percentage of renewable capacity by state. You see a lot in Maine, Minnesota, South Carolina, but it's not always kind of California is not I think at the top of the list here. So I'm gonna now leave the panel to tell us more about their perspective, and we are going to start actually with the academic perspective. And each of you has 15 minutes, and Nick here is going to give you, he has nice cards, he's prepared, give you a warning, 5-minute warning. And so we'll start with Deepak. Do you want to say a few words, Omar? And Omar is going to introduce the speakers.
All right, good morning. Just a few words about Deepak. Deepak is an assistant professor here at UCLA Institute of Environment, and we stole him recently from UC Berkeley, and we convinced him to come down with us. Deepak has an incredible background. He's got a background in both engineering side, technical side, and also as a training as an economist. So we're very happy to have Deepak with us today. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks for the opportunity to be on this panel. So I wanted to speak about the recent experience with biofuel policies, mainly in the US, but generally worldwide, and draw some general conclusions that are relevant not only to biofuels, but broadly to renewable and environmental policies more generally. But biofuel policy is what I have studied a little bit more. So, there are a variety of different policies. I know this session is titled as Overcoming Market Barriers, but if you look at it, there are a number of different policies, types of policies in the US and the world over, actually more than, in fact, almost every major oil-consuming and oil-importing country has one or more policies targeted towards biofuels in the transportation sector mainly. So in the US, we have the Renewable Fuel Standard, which basically mandates a quantity. There are specific targets for different kinds of biofuels, but it's basically mandating a quantity of biofuel to be consumed by a given date. So specifically 15 billion gallons of corn ethanol by 2015, and going forward beyond 2015, increasing what is called the second generation or cellulosic biofuels, which we don't have today, but we want about 21 billion gallons of them by 2022. The other policy, it's in italics here, is basically the low carbon fuel standard, which has been adopted in California. There are some problems with that. Basically, there is some uncertainty about whether this will go forward because it seems to be in violation of the interstate commerce clause and stuff. But essentially, it's basically mandating the reduction in the greenhouse gas intensity of fuels. It doesn't mandate a specific fuel like biofuel or corn ethanol or something, but it's basically mandating the reduction of carbon intensity of transportation fuel. So it's sort of technology neutral, but it's de facto a biofuel policy because currently compliance is likely to be achieved by blending biofuels. It's cheaper than any other way by which you could reduce greenhouse gas intensity, say electric vehicles or other things. And then after these two regulations, which you have other kinds of supports like a subsidy. So and here you have a direct subsidy, which is the two types of those. One is the blender's tax credit, a 50 cent per gallon tax credit per gallon of ethanol, which actually expired December 2011. economists have been calling for that to expire for a long time, so it's nice to see that it's gone in a way. Then there is the investment tax credit, which basically is based on giving investments, subsidized investments in the form of loan guarantees and so on, and preferential tax treatments. And then there are indirect subsidies, which agricultural crops, agricultural-based fuels benefit from, the whole bunch of agricultural support policies, income support, and all those policies. And then there is import tariffs, which is basically aimed at keeping the market open mainly for domestic sources, and this is to basically keep our sugarcane ethanol from Brazil, which is cheaper, from coming in. And this also expired in 2011 December. So, and then there is flex fuel credits under CAFE standards. Flex fuel vehicles are treated preferentially. Automakers have to meet a certain CAFE standard, which is actually ramped up now, but flex fuel vehicles receive extra credits regardless of whether the flex fuel is run on E85 ethanol or not. There are a variety of different policies. What has been the impact? The impact has been, it's a very mixed bag. So there are, I list 4 or 5 criteria that policymakers care about, or it's often mentioned when you read these regulations the way they are written. The first is with respect to fuel price. The impact of biofuels on fuel price has been both ways. I would say that so biofuels are a costlier resource. It's costlier than fossil fuels, and that's probably why we need the policy. So generally, mandating the consumption of a costlier technology is going to raise the cost of fuel. But in some instances, when the supply of fossil fuel is very inelastic and demand is growing very fast, like what happened in 2008 when price of oil was about $90, $100 a barrel, even touching $140 a barrel. For this small amount of time, actually, the policy was not binding. And so biofuels were cheaper, and that they're helping reduce fuel prices. It was not very tangible because the prices were spiraling away, but it did have a small, a significant positive impact on prices, brought it down. But in general, during other times, it's probably raising fuel cost to consumers. In terms of energy security, it's a very poorly defined term. It means different things to different people, but if you could broadly define it as a domestic resource or reducing dependence on imports from certain regions or certain types of fuels, definitely they've had an impact. I mean, it's a domestic resource, and so this is probably one reason where biofuels is the main reason for biofuel. It's a simple, mature technology that almost any country can produce which has land. It's an agricultural-based country, so can use it. So definitely a positive impact. It's hard to quantify, and it's also hard to say how cost-effective it is. I mean, the biofuels are not the only way to achieve that. So cost-effectiveness is always a question. In terms of food supply, it's unambiguously negative because it basically reduces food supply. So it basically raises the cost of food, and this is an unintended consequence and a pretty large one. And finally, in greenhouse gas emissions, it's hard to say whether they had any positive impact on greenhouse gas emissions. On the one hand, if you look at biofuels simply as, if you do the accounting of carbon based on what goes into making biofuels, you take the whole life cycle, it's on per unit of fuel, it's probably less carbon intensive than fossil fuels. I mean, remember, the fossil fuels are getting dirtier with time as we transition to oil sands and heavy offshore oil and heavy oil and enhanced oil recoveries, which is more carbon intensive. But you have to take into account the fact that there are indirect effects. In a moment, I'll speak about it. So it's not very clear if you expand biofuels, we are going to still have those benefits of that you seem to have when you do a unit-by-unit comparison of what exists today. So what are some of the general lessons that we can learn that we can extend to other technologies, solar, wind, storage, whatever. So the first is that the effects of scaling infant technologies or nascent technologies. The first is that on the one hand, here you have two different effects. On the one hand, you have unit cost of production goes down because of learning by doing and other scale economies. So there is some positive externality which you want to address that justifies some support for infant industries, infant technologies. But from a system perspective, there may be unintended negative effects that simply are not pecuniary externalities. So as you scale one industry, it's going to draw away resources from other activities, and so raise the prices of those inputs. An example is food price increase. I mean, it has definitely ethical and moral and other implications or equity considerations, but purely from even an efficiency perspective, if it's all it's doing is raising prices in some other market and raising prices in this market, that is what economists would call like a pecuniary externality, which is really not having any efficiency implications. But when you don't have, when there is market failure, for example, when emissions are not priced in land sector, so there is no land, there's no cap on emissions from other sectors, there is no cap on emissions from land use is not priced. So if you're expanding agriculture and that's causing land use change emissions, this is a real externality. I mean, this is what you would call an indirect effect or indirect land use change effect. So when you take into account these things, which really is not traceable to any single unit of biofuel, it's not that any single atomistic competitive biofuel producer is causing these effects, but the system as a whole, when you scale these things up, you actually induce big price changes in land markets, which leads to expansion of agriculture, leads to people in Brazil cutting forests or wherever. So it's really hard to, but this is a real indirect effect of scaling nascent technologies, which really is not attributable, but is a consequence. So we don't know how to deal with those still. I mean, even in solar and wind, you could think of it. I mean, as you increase the penetration of solar and wind, which are intermittent resources, you basically are inducing more cycling of the base load plants, which causes increase in emissions. And if you don't have emissions under a cap, it means it's basically an externality. You're going to increase emissions. So these are effects of scaling, some positive, some negative, that need to be taken into account. So a related concern is leakage. So the fact is that pollution shifting can occur. What are you doing with some technologies is you're basically shifting pollution to other sectors. If you're reducing tailpipe emissions through electric vehicles, you're increasing emissions in the power generation sector. So this is what you would call pollution shifting or pollution shuffling. And so here policymakers deserve some credit because they have tried to implement life cycle based policies. So California low carbon fuel standard is a life cycle based policy. The RFS, the renewable fuel standard, has life cycle based limits on biofuels. It's appealing in principle. You want to take a life cycle perspective, but it's very complicated in reality because of indirect effects, things that occur because of system expansion, and it's hard to regulate them, yet you cannot ignore them. So this is a real challenge. It also increases the information burden of these policies. Policymakers are required to have more and more information. All you can say there is we have to pursue economy-wide or multilateral policies to minimize leakage to unregulated markets or unregulated regions. The third is that there are multiple goals, and multiple goals require multiple instruments. It's nice to imagine that we're able to hit all targets with one goal, all targets with one instrument, like renewable fuels. We're hitting energy security, pollution, domestic jobs, and everything. But it's very hard to target all of them. You have unintended consequences. The main thing, since I'm short of time, I'm not going to go over this, but this is sort of a multi-criteria comparison based on the quantity of biofuel, the global emissions, the impact on domestic import outlay, in terms of the impact on fuel consumer surplus, in terms of domestic producer surplus, domestic biofuels producer surplus, and government revenue. And we looked at 5 policies: a carbon tax, a generic biofuel mandate. You could replace it with a renewable portfolio standard for electricity and replace biofuels with solar. You would get a similar result. An emission standard, like an LCFS, a combination of a tax and a mandate, and a corn ethanol mandate, which is what we have today. And you pretty much see that one thing you can see that the corn ethanol mandate has performed. A rank of 5 means it's worse. A rank of 1 means it's good with respect to any criteria. And you see that the corn ethanol mandate actually performs worse on more criteria than any other policy. The carbon tax performs better on more number of criteria than any other policy, and all the others are in between. And some are better for some, and some are better for the others. So it's really a combination of, but any one is not going to get you all the objectives. It's not really like a problem in decision analysis where you're really trying to, whether the option is to build something here or not build something there. It's more like you could design multiple policy instruments, and we should be designing policy instruments targeting each one. I'm not going to do this in the interest of time. The fourth is to reduce uncertainty yet maintain flexibility. Policies like feed-in tariffs and renewable fuel mandates have a role because they give certainty in terms of market demand for people to undertake costly and long-lived investments. But they should also adjust to economic trends. One of the problems was we had the renewable fuel mandates which were not indexed to food prices. So as food prices went up, we still had demand for mandates, which was basically making food to be diverted to fuel. And so indexing subsidies, mandates to performance or some kind of market conditions is something we need to do, and it's still not happened. Actually, there is a bill which was proposed by I don't know what happened to it, but it's being considered to index mandates to food prices in the case of biofuels. And we could think of similar thing, indexing it to fossil fuel prices, indexing it to electricity prices, and so on, but we don't have those kind of policies. So I think it's important to index and yet give certainty. Achieving that balance is the key. So to summarize, it's sort of a very somewhat I gave as an academic. I don't have an expert, and I've not looked at how these policies have been made. Somebody once said policies are like sausages. You don't want to see them being made. But I think we have tools. I mean, economists have ways of actually inferring ex post what was the real driver, and we see that the driver for renewable fuel standard in the case of corn ethanol was basically either energy security or supporting the domestic biofuel industry, not pollution, not fuel consumers, and so on. So we can infer ex post as to what was the drivers. The problem is not one of really just removing barriers to renewables, but I would say the more important thing is what is the shape and form in which we remove these barriers. So mandating and subsidizing renewables versus taxing based on pollution. These are two different approaches which will have very different effects. So mandates and subsidies for current technologies may end up locking us into technologies and creating barriers for future better technologies. So the key is to achieve the right mix of tax, mandate, and subsidy to meet the different objectives, such as security, emissions, and prices. So it's more an art than a science, I think. But yes, yeah, that's all I had.